Hello. Hi. I am live, I think.
Yes, you are live.
Okay. So, and is somebody introducing me or anything else?
I don't think so at the moment. They are all expecting, I mean, they can watch this now, actually.
There are no viewers, so what does that mean?
That's strange because I actually am viewing it currently on my laptop, so that must mean just that it's not registering there, but I can show you online.
Okay. How do I know that someone's out there? Hello, everybody.
Well, I've been monitoring it on my laptop as well. Double check that everything is working.
Maybe Shiv could also send me an email.
Yes.
Yeah. Shiv, are you there? And if so, please send me an email confirming that you see and hear me.
There is a bit of a lag, so that might be the other reason it's not showing.
And can I hear people?
On this, no, because it's only unidirectional, but they are writing in questions, and you can see their questions here. So, see, these are all the people that are currently online, because these were all sent in just now.
Okay. All right.
I think the top two are actually Columbia MVP students.
Good. We'll get started shortly. We're just letting people to log on, and then we'll get started. Okay, good.
I'm sorry. These are your headphones.
Yeah. No problem. Oh, which ones are mine? These. Okay.
So, yeah. So this is what everyone else is seeing.
Yeah, good. Okay, great.
So.
Okay. Viewers are joining in, so thanks for being patient. We'll just allow a couple more minutes. That's fine. Okay.
I just want to, just in case there are tech problems, I don't.
No problem. Okay, let's get started. I'm Jeff Sachs here, and thought it would be a good idea since we weren't able to connect at COP21 last week, despite some efforts at it to connect today, now that the Paris conference is over. And I would propose to offer a short summary of what happened and then turn it over for questions. But what you were witnessing at COP21 was the current real multilateralism around sustainable development. COP21 was the third of the big conferences of 2015 to set the Sustainable Development Agenda. Remember that Addis Ababa, the financing for development in July, was number one. Then adopting the Sustainable Development Goals in September was number two. And then agreeing on a climate agenda at COP21 in Paris was number three. First thing to say is that all three summits produced results. They all three produced a global consensus, which is amazing. Not one of them involved a vote of countries. In any one of them, technically, a dissenting delegation could have stopped the whole thing because the UN in this context works under unanimity terms. And even in COP21, where some of the biggest challenges that the world faces are on the agenda and trillions of dollars are at stake, any one of the 196 parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change could have stood up and said, I object, and it would have thrown the whole conference into an insoluble crisis. So that didn't happen. All 196 governments agreed to go along with the agreement, though one in particular, Nicaragua, made a very interesting statement saying that it didn't agree with the Paris Agreement, but that it wouldn't object to it. So it allowed the agreement to go through, but it voiced its objection. Remember who these parties are to the conference. This is the signatories of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in 1992 at the Earth Summit and ratified in 1994, or went into force in 1994. There are 196 signatories. They include the 193 UN member states plus three. The three are Cook Islands, Niue, and the European Union, which is also a signatory in addition to its individual members. And that's how you get to 196. So what they signed was an agreement, now called the Paris Agreement. And together with the Paris Agreement are a set of decisions to support the Paris Agreement. I hope that everybody has gone online to download the Paris Agreement and the decisions. If you haven't, that's an assignment. You'll find it at unfccc.int, INT, and then just search on the website for the Paris Agreement and read it because it's important. It's important for climate change, and it's important for understanding how the international system works. It has two parts, as I've said. It has an agreement itself, which is an agreement to implement the Framework Convention, and then it has a set of supporting decisions, basically, which enable the agreement to go forward. What was agreed is good and important. The most important thing that was agreed was the objectives that should guide the world in implementing the UN Framework Convention. The original convention said that the purpose was to stabilize greenhouse gases to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. Now, dangerous interference is defined. It's defined as a limit on warming. And specifically, the new limit in the Paris Agreement says that the world and the parties to the convention agree to take actions to limit warming to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius. And then, I don't remember the exact words, but to continue to strengthen actions to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. That's the overarching agenda. And those are big goals because they would go far in avoiding catastrophe for the world if achieved. We know that the main way to achieve these goals is by reducing sharply greenhouse gas emissions. And indeed, the Paris Agreement says that the emissions should be reduced so sharply that by the second half of the century, there is a balance between the low level of emissions of greenhouse gases and the natural uptake of those gases in natural sinks on the planet, meaning the terrestrial uptake of CO2 mainly in plant life, and second, the ocean take-up of CO2 as CO2 is dissolved into the ocean and then buried over long periods in the deep ocean. And what is called for is stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations by balancing what goes up and what comes back down. In other words, the sources and the sinks. Of course, we're way out of balance right now. We have around 40 billion tons of CO2 emitted each year. And the net uptake in biological sinks is something, and in the oceans, I should say, is about half of that. So there's a huge, huge imbalance. We're going to have to get down to basically close to zero emissions from energy and from deforestation. And in fact, reverse the deforestation to afforestation and land reclamation for biological storage of CO2 rather than biological net release of CO2. A shorthand expression is deep decarbonization. Now, that term was not used at all in the document as far as I remember, and largely because some of the big oil countries, led by Saudi Arabia, agreed to use the term decarbonization. They said that, well, why just focus on one of the greenhouse gases when methane, nitrous oxide, and others are also important? The truth is, of course, carbon dioxide is the most important of the anthropogenic greenhouse gases, and we should have used the term decarbonization, but did not. So an agreement like this is important. It's important in focusing the world on a specific target and on describing the pathways to achieve the target. But an agreement like this is not a self-enforcing agreement. Just because the world adopts 2 degrees C or well below 2 degrees C or progressive strengthening of actions to achieve below 1.5 degrees C, of course, doesn't make it happen. And the enforcement mechanisms are ranging from non-existent to very weak. And indeed, the main actions that governments are promising are essentially not legally binding, even in the sense of international law. They are what might be called voluntary contributions. The technical term in the agreement is the intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. And of the 196 signatory countries, around 185 signatory countries have filed INDCs, typically out to the year 2025 or 2030. And these INDCs pledge a certain level of action. And it's possible to then add up the commitments under these INDCs and ask whether they're consistent with the goal of 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C, or I should say a limit of 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C. The answer right now is no, they are not consistent. The intended nationally determined contributions that have been filed with the Secretariat probably would be consistent with warming on the order of 3 to 4 degrees C rather than 2 or well below 2 or 1.5 degrees C. there's some debate about this because how you interpret these contributions in the years after 2030, and also the underlying model of climate change and how it relates to emissions is also, of course, uncertain. And so there's a range of uncertainty, but I think it's generally agreed that the voluntary contributions that have been made are not yet consistent with the upper limits that have been established. So the agreement calls for two things that I think are notable. One is for countries to submit longer-term plans that go beyond 2030. This is a clause that I fought for very hard, and that our UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network project fought for very hard, and we got it into the agreement. It's, I think, Article 4, paragraph 19, I think, which says that all countries should submit what they call low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, low greenhouse gas emission development strategies out to the year 2050, rather than 2030, out to mid-century. This is, I think, an important step because it will help governments to understand what are the options and what are the challenges of going much deeper than they have so far pledged. The other point that's notable is that there is an understanding that the contributions that have been made will continue to be reassessed, analyzed, and progressively strengthened at roughly a 5-year cycle. So countries are going to be encouraged to submit new INDCs every 5 years, and for the combined set of INDCs to be evaluated against the globally agreed targets. The point is, it's a progressive set of steps. This is not the final word or the final set of commitments. It's an initial set of commitments that then is to be strengthened every 5-year period. You know, this could work. This is what mathematicians would call a hill climbing algorithm, which is that you're trying to reach the summit. You go up a part of the mountain, you take partial derivatives, you go up another part of the mountain, you take new set of partial derivatives, you go up another part of the mountain, and you keep proceeding in a hill climbing mode, like Isaac Newton developed as an iterative process a few hundred years ago. And we need to do this in a globally constructive, worldwide manner. I think there's merit in that view. So unlike cynics who say it doesn't add up, this is worthless, or cynics who say this is all hopeless, the idea is learning, experience, demonstration, encouragement, first mover advantages, peer pressure that step by step make us to have tighter goals, stronger standards, and that we don't give up on the ultimate objectives. And that's how I see this process really working. So that's a quick summary. Strong goals, short-term commitments, a pledge to have longer-term pathways, some financing and technology pledges, but nothing too clear or too strong, and a commitment to upgrade all of this every 5 years. So what I said is, let's hail this agreement. It's a diplomatic triumph, but let's get to work, because this is not by itself guaranteeing climate safety. It's not even by any means guaranteeing that the specific goals that have been set will be achieved. I'll stop here and turn to questions. And I see that some have been put. So let me start with the question from Maggie Clifford. New York Times says it's almost as if the climate deal over the weekend did not even happen, seeing how few of the Republican candidates remarked on it. A stark reminder of how partisan the issue has become. The Republican Party in the U.S. is in a very unacceptable and in a way, difficult to explain situation. It's anti-scientific. It's in denial about climate change itself. It's in a horrible mood, which basically says, we won't do anything. And if other countries want to do something, then especially we won't do anything because we don't like any other countries. So the Congress, the Republican-led Congress, is hostile, surly, anti-scientific. And if you listen to them, they sound so incredibly ignorant and stupid that you can't even believe it. So there is a big debate. Are they as dumb as they sound, or are they more corrupt than they appear to be? And I lean towards the latter interpretation, that this is a matter of political corruption rather than sheer foolishness. And by political corruption, I mean that the Republican Party is basically owned by the big oil, coal, and natural gas interests. And when you look at the campaign contributions and the way that the American Petroleum Institute works, how the Koch brothers operate in the US and so forth, it's basically corruption. But the United States, being a free market country, has legalized this kind of corruption. So whether it's against the law or not, probably not. But whether it's ugly and nasty and powerful interests against the public good, I would say yes. I think the big result of the climate agreement is that 196 signatories, that is 195 countries in the world, basically told the Republicans in Congress, you're on your own. You're way out on a limb. You don't represent global anything, because every single country has signed on to this. And I do believe that the Republican Party does not represent the will of the American people. The opinion surveys show that Americans, by about 70%, majority, want action on climate. And I think the Republicans are in a losing position. Of course, they have some constituency that believes this, but it's not a winning governing majority. And I don't think that they're really going to last in this way. Politicians are very malleable, and when they begin to lose elections on this issue, which I think is coming, they will change their views. So I wouldn't say that the Republican Congress can really stop the Paris implementation. I just don't believe that it will. So another question from Gary Verberg is, after such a historic year of multilateral agreements, what would you say are the primary determinants of whether these conventions will result in concrete and observable outcomes? I think the most important single determinant will be whether there are clear actions that governments can and should take to fulfill these goals. So the next step is turning the goals into identifiable specific actions. Politicians are not, in general, very abstract in their thinking. They are very concrete. Okay, what should I do? They don't want to hear high theory. They're not in a classroom. So I like to suggest the very practical approaches that the politicians can sign on to. And I think that's really our next step. What does decarbonization mean, for example? How could universal health coverage, SDG 3, be achieved? How could universal access to modern energy services, SDG 7, practically be achieved, and so forth? We need to show technical, sound, responsible, affordable pathways to achieve these goals. And I think the expert communities play a very big role in that. A second thing is keeping the peace. The biggest obstacle to multilateralism is war and distrust. We need close cooperation between the US, China, India, Europe, and so forth. But if we're enmeshed in conflict, in an arms race, in a spiral of vituperation, if we're trapped in wars in the Middle East, it will drain attention and will to actually get get the job done. And so in this sense, I believe the overall geopolitical situation is going to be extremely important. It's one of the reasons why, in addition to the SDGs, I always encourage governments to settle their strategic challenges like the Syria crisis inside the United Nations Security Council rather than through unilateral bombing runs or unilateral actions by the United States or hostility between the US and Russia and so forth. Because not only does that kind of unilateralism not work, but it also absolutely drains the will for the multilateral problem solving that we need. I'll go to a question of Annika Barra, who asks, Dr. Sachs, in our MDP session, I mentioned the hurdle of climate financing. Can you elaborate on the outcome and the process that emerged regarding financing climate objectives? Well, this is a pretty frustrating area so far, and a pretty unsatisfactory area to date. First, what is climate financing? Climate financing means investing in low carbon energy systems, investing in climate change adaptation, and investing in climate change disaster response to storms and hurricanes and so forth. So there are many aspects of things that need financing, both the mitigation and the adaptation for climate change, as well as the response to specific crises when they occur. All of those areas are chronically underfinanced right now. Even if we say, here's how to decarbonize, actually getting the money to shift from fossil fuel development to renewable energy development is a major challenge. The financing requires a mix of public and private sector financing. And at the aggregate scale, it involves a shift of trillions of dollars away from the conventional coal, oil, and gas sector to the low carbon energy sector, meaning solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, hydropower, carbon capture and sequestration as zero, and some biofuels as low carbon or zero carbon primary energy sources, and towards technologies like electric vehicles and away from the internal combustion engine vehicles. Trillions of dollars will need to shift. Much of that will come from private market forces of businesses that are essentially chasing profits. And that's the easiest kind, because that's a bit self-organizing, because self-interested companies that are profit-oriented undertake a lot of the investments. And to the extent that we have a carbon price or regulatory framework that's clear, that will also very much help to shift the private funding. But in addition to that, we need many kinds of public funding as well. Public funding meaning from budgets, basically. So why do we need public funding? We need public funding because the public sector finances a lot of infrastructure, the roads, the highways, the ports, the airports. And the question of whether that infrastructure is low carbon or high carbon is going to be a very, very big issue in the future. We need the public sector because a lot of the low carbon energy technologies require public lands, maybe in deserts, or public lands that are going to cover the transmission, or that are going to be the places where the transmission lines are set to carry renewable energy to high population centers. And we need climate financing to help the poorest countries that simply don't have their own means and their own budgetary resources and their own creditworthiness to be able to finance these changes on their own. So that's a kind of development assistance, but development assistance organized around climate actions. Of the trillions of dollars that will be needed each year to be directed towards low carbon energy and towards adaptation and resilience in disaster response, maybe $100 to $200 billion a year right now should be directed towards the low-income countries to help them build a, say, renewable energy system, or breakwaters from flooding from the rising sea level, or other kinds of adaptation. So only a fraction of what's really needed will go as a form of development assistance. Now, back in 2009, the rich countries, primarily the countries of the OECD, promised that they would provide $100 billion a year of some kind of financing for the poor countries for these challenges of climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And I thought that when this announcement was made back in 2009, that by the time we reached the Paris Agreement, we would have, first of all, a full package of $100 billion a year securely in view. But at a minimum, we would have defined who's putting in what, how much, on what timeline, and what constitutes climate financing. In other words, the definitions of the terms. Well, we just signed a climate agreement without solving any of those problems. The $100 billion by the year 2020 remains a commitment. In fact, now the commitment says that after 2020 and starting in 2025, the $100 billion per year is a floor upon which we will build added financing for the future. And yet, while that remains part of the agreement, there's no definition of what is climate financing, what is the $100 billion, who is it going to come from, how is it going to be achieved, what kinds of projects is it going to go for. It's amazing to me that in 6 years, these issues were not properly sorted out. And one of the examples of the controversy on all of this is that last month, in the lead up to Paris, it was absolutely absurd that the OECD, which is the organization of the high-income countries, issued a study announcing that $62 billion per year was already mobilized for climate financing. So the report said, don't worry about the $100 billion, we're already 2/3 of the way there. And yet the recipient countries, the low-income countries, said, are you kidding? 62 billion and we didn't even notice it? What are you talking about? What are you counting? Are you double counting money you've given us for other purposes? What is climate financing? And the truth is, the OECD report was very vague, very unsatisfactory, and really, in a way, mischievous, because it announced a high number, but it didn't explain who was getting it. It didn't say who the recipients were. It didn't say why it was counting certain things in certain ways. And it certainly was not additional funds on top of other development financing. So that's a long story to say we don't have a climate financing system yet. Neither the big picture of the trillions nor even the little picture of the $100 billion per year. We don't have agreed rules. We've set up some new institutions like the Green Climate Fund, but basically these institutions are seriously underfunded and without much of a strategic vision of what they're doing, and without much guarantee of the financing to come. I think it's all been cynical on the part of the high-income countries, because they kind of ran out the clock, as we would say in football, American football, just not taking the issue seriously and saying, let's just sign the agreement. And the agreement doesn't disown the $100 billion, but it doesn't really advance the achievement of this $100 billion per year. It's going to be one of my diplomatic goals in the coming year to push harder on defining what this is and helping to identify where it's going to come from. And I think that this is a story still to be told. If you hold for 1 second, I'll be right back. So let me take another question. Let's see. So John Gilliard asks, what's the best role of business in this whole process? And this also is very interesting question for multilateralism. If you look at the actual agreement, it is an agreement of the signatories of the UN Framework Convention. That is 196 political units, 195 sovereign countries, plus the European Union. Businesses are not signatories. Cities are not signatories. Scientists are not signatories. Universities are not signatories. So this is really an intergovernmental agreement. But solving the climate crisis, of course, is what we typically call a multi-stakeholder process. And the big investments are going to come from the business sector. They're going to, and the big sales of technologies and the appliances and the energy use will be not fully in the private sector, but at least more than half in the private sector, whether it's purchases of automobiles or purchases of buildings and commercial structures, or energy using appliances, or industrial processes, or farming and so forth. These are private sector activities. And yet the private sector isn't technically even part of the negotiations. So this year, more than ever before, around the meeting, literally in the environs around where the main discussion was taking place of the negotiators, businesses were there in big numbers to say, here's what we're doing if we're the cement industry or the steel industry or agriculture or the power sector or the oil companies. They were quite well represented all through the 2 weeks of COP21. And I was working heavily with something called the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, WBCSD. And WBCSD is a voluntary organization of large numbers of businesses, hundreds or thousands, I don't know the full tally, of major businesses around the world that said, we want to be sustainable in our business practices. And so WBCSD was a major voice for business to say yes to governments, go for a safe climate regime, and we will develop the products and the protocols and the systems to shift from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. And the BCSD also organized what they called the LTCPI, which was the long-term, the it's LCTPI, the Low Carbon Technology Partnership Initiative. And that is an initiative of various sectors, say the automotive sector, the power sector, the shipping sector, aviation, cement, steel, petrochemicals, in each of these sectors to say, we have a path for our own decarbonization. And this, I think, was quite interesting. And of course, there was also a group of billionaires led by Bill Gates, Jack Ma, Mukesh Ambani, and others from around the world who pledged together this group of billionaires that they would invest, I think they said at least $10 billion a year, should check the number, in developing technologies for low carbon energy. And they're going to do mainly on a business basis. So the simple answer is business is absolutely critical. A business has to be guided by incentives like carbon pricing. It has to be guided by investors who are divesting from fossil fuels and investing in renewables. It has to be guided by public procurement policies and regulatory policies that say, in the future, you're not allowed to build coal-fired power plants, or if it's a vendor, say, of taxi fleets to cities, we're only going to buy zero-emission taxis, such as electric vehicles, battery-operated vehicles, or fuel cell vehicles, and so forth. I think the bottom line is that sustainable development in general, and climate change in particular, requires complex interactions between the public sector and the private sector. Some of it truly is public-private partnership. Some of it is the public sector setting the rules of the game, such as you're not allowed to make carbon emissions anymore, or you have to pay a tax on carbon. And then the private sector acting competitively within the rules of the game set by the public sector. Some of it is public financing. For example, to say to the private sector, we'll help to fund your research and development activities in low carbon technologies, or we'll match you half and half, or we'll give you tax breaks in order to be able to do this. So I think what we have ahead is lots of public-private partnerships, as well as complex interactions through the tax system, through public sector outlays, through the regulatory process, in which the public sector sets a low carbon framework, and the private sector, we hope, creatively and often driven by the profit motive, delivers the goods in the sense of coming up with solutions that are marketable and commercial. I think I will take one more question, and let me, so it says Scott Barrett of Columbia has said that countries are unlikely to meet even their INDCs. If he's correct, what other strategies could be taken to avert the potentially catastrophic impacts of climate change? Scott is a world expert in global negotiations and on questions like how to reach an agreement, how to enforce agreements, what happens if agreements are not enforceable, such as this one. Will the players to such an agreement continue to keep their word, or will they defect, as we say in game theory? So cooperation versus defection from this treaty. I don't think we know. I don't think we know yet. What is true in a voluntary game such as this is that even when you sign the treaty, there's a lot of free rider problems where individual countries say, yeah, we really want to reduce emissions, so you guys do it first, and we'll be there later on, but we don't want to bear the costs early on. And this is, of course, part of the deep structure of the climate crisis. The climate crisis is driven by worldwide emissions, and therefore it's natural for any one place to say, well, we don't make so much of a difference, we'll continue doing what we're doing because it's the least cost approach, and let the others take the adjustment. And so this is also what we would call the tragedy of the commons, or a pure public goods problem, which says that we have a joint benefit in cooperating, but an individual interest in defecting or reneging on our contribution because we want to free ride on the contributions of others. What can one do in these circumstances? One can put on a lot of peer pressure, because cooperation can be sustained through naming and shaming, and by encouraging everybody to join in together. It's really possible, but not assured. It's possible to put some enforcement mechanisms in place, perhaps, countries that don't abide by low carbon technology being told that we're going to limit the importation of your goods in the future. So using the teeth of trade policy to help enforce the climate agreement. It can be carrots rather than sticks, as we would say, incentives rather than punishments, by saying to poor countries, okay, we'll really follow through on the climate financing so that you have the incentive actually to carry through on your intended nationally determined contributions. Another way that I believe is very important is to define more precisely what it is that each country should do. I like very much an observation of President John F. Kennedy made in 1963 when he said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So to repeat, Kennedy said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable, we can help to draw people to achieve that goal. And I believe in that, that it's not just the clash of interests or the problems of free riding. It's also the knowing what to do. It's the clarity about what's called for. And once there is clarity, then it's easier for us to hold others accountable also, to say, come on, here is a pathway. It's good for you. It makes sense. We're doing it. You do it. This is the fair approach. Let's get on with it. In the end, I think that's our best hope, that we define fairly clearly across countries, here's what deep decarbonization really means. Here's why it's not so expensive. Here's why it's practical. Here are the technologies that can help us to do this. And we're going to do it. They're going to do it. They're going to do it. You do it also. And we use the kind of peer pressure, annual reviews, lots of meetings, which people say is yak, 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 just talk shops, but it's really a way to hold each other to account for what we've said, even if it's not legally binding. It's in effect a kind of normative or moral force that encourages the countries to stay on track. That's why I believe that the knowledge networks, the universities, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, all have a role to play, because we can help define the goal more clearly. We can help to make it seem more manageable and less remote. And that, I think, is a job of the knowledge communities, to say, here's what can be done, here's how to do it, and it's fair if everybody does it together. Well, let me end on this note. I want to thank all of you for the course, for listening in today. And we're at the end of the semester, so it also behooves me to wish all of you very, very happy holidays. And a happy, safe, and healthy new year. And I look forward to being together with you virtually this way or in person in the classroom sometime very soon. Thanks a lot, and all best wishes.